I want to welcome everyone. My name is Penny Wright. Joanna Ferron is here also from our library, and we are delighted this evening to have Andrea Bernstein with us. She is the author, as you probably know, of a really terrific book called American Oligarchs, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the Marriage of Money and Power. I have to confess, I'm just at the very beginning of this book, but it reads like a novel, I can tell you that, and I'm only at the beginning. She is the co-host of the Trump Inc. podcast, which is a co-production with ProPublica. Andrea Bernstein covers the business of the Trump administration and with her colleagues has broken key stories, including those on how Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump avoided criminal indictments, Paul Manafort's money laundering, Michael Cohen's fraudulent business practices, and Rudy Giuliani's dealings in Ukraine. A longtime and regular contributor to NPR, Andrea Bernstein has covered 6 national elections, including the 2016 election, and her beats have included government, politics, transportation, the environment, housing, and policing. At various points, she has been assigned to cover Hillary Clinton, Rudy Giuliani, Michael Bloomberg, George Pataki, Eliot Spitzer, David Patterson, Chris Christie, Bill de Blasio, and Andrew Cuomo. Her investigative reporting on the Bridgegate scandal with Mark Katz won WNYC News its first ever Peabody Award. Bernstein was also one of 12 U.S. journalists to win a prestigious year-long 2007 Knight Fellowship at Stanford University, and she's won over 50 awards for her work. She has taught journalism at City College, was the Jack Newfield Professor of Investigative Journalism at Hunter College, and has been a political correspondent for the New York Observer for 8 years. And her work has also appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Washington Post, ProPublica, the Guardian, New York Magazine, The Nation, and the New York Daily News. It is a real honor to have her here. So thank you, Andrea Bernstein, for being with us, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Penny, and thank you everyone for coming. I know it's dinner hour, and I also know it's very hot. So I appreciate your attention. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what prompted me to write this book and read a small portion from the prologue, talk a little bit about what is in the book, and then I would love to take your questions about the book or about anything else related to the business of Trump, which is something that I sort of have been covering full time for, I guess, the last, since November 2016, so whatever that is, 3 years and 8 months. So I was the political correspondent, and I had covered government corruption for really about 25 years, and politics and government, but with a specialty in corruption and sort of digging out records. And there are many different places to place the origin of this particular story. But in the fall of 2013, I was covering both transportation and politics, and noticed a very unusual traffic jam that was really caused by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey over the George Washington Bridge. And the traffic jam was unusual, and the reasons given for why the lanes were realigned was unusual. And I began to cover the Bridgegate scandal. And I worked on that from really 2013, which was when the time of the traffic jam, right up until the trial, which was in 2016. And the story was about misappropriation of government resources. It was about using the resources of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey which I don't know if anybody has flown from any of the airports recently. I understand LaGuardia is better, though I haven't been there. But I think those of you who use the airports or the bridges and tunnels or the other facilities that the Port Authority owns and runs would be distressed to learn that the resources of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey were, instead of going to the ratepayers and the fee payers and those of us that use the services, we're going to enhance the political fortunes of the governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. And that's what the Bridgegate trial was really about. It was about using government resources, taxpayer resources, to help a political campaign. So I had covered Bridgegate, and during 2016, I was covering both the Bridgegate trial and the 2016 election, which were sort of, the Bridgegate trial ended around Halloween, so they just completely overlapped. And during the election, I had focused on Hillary Clinton because I had covered her since she had run for Senate in New York, really since 1999, since she indicated her intention to run for Senate in New York. And I had a lot of archival tape, and I had covered her various bids for Senate, and I knew a lot about her. I'd covered her 2008 run for president. So in 2016, I had a lot of institutional knowledge about Hillary Clinton and a lot of archival tape. And I hadn't so much focused on the business of Trump in that election because my colleague Matt Katz was working on that, and I was also covering the Bridgegate trial. And then the election came to its conclusion, and I thought to myself, I really understand this world that Trump came out of. I understand his business. I understand the way he has interacted with the political system in New York and in New Jersey. And I know a lot of the people and a lot of the players that interacted with him. And I was really in a unique position to report on this. So I began to figure out how I was going to report on the business of Trump and started to do some reporting. One of the very first pieces of reporting that I did was I decided I was going to look at the land records of New York, which are online, and look at everybody that lived in Trump Tower. Now, it's really hard to figure out who lives in Trump Tower because it's a lot of limited liability companies. In fact, one of the things I learned in reporting my book is that Donald Trump pioneered the use of limited liability companies in New York real estate, which allows you to obscure the ownership and the series of transactions around them. And with my colleague Ilya Maritz, we started at the 29th floor, which was the first residential floor, and we went up and we got to the 43rd floor, and we got to apartment 43G, which belonged to Paul Manafort. And there was a really unusual financing pattern. And we thought, wow, that's strange. He had paid for all cash, meaning he had paid for his apartment without a loan. And then he, in the name of a shell company, which was called John Hanna LLC, which has a whole story, which I can tell about another time. And then he converted it into his name and took out a big bank loan. And it turned out he had done the same pattern in other properties, including in Brooklyn and in Soho and in Bridgehampton. So right next door to you. And we talked to a lot of experts. We talked to prosecutors, we talked to real estate professors, we talked to people in the real estate profession. We said, what is this? What is going on here? And they said, well, that really sure looks like money laundering. So we did that story and we said, we don't know what this is, but we've talked to these experts and they say it sure looks like money laundering. And then in October of that year, Paul Manafort was in fact indicted for money laundering and ultimately pleaded guilty to conspiracy against the United States and filing false statements to banks. And among the offenses that he admitted doing was laundering money around these properties in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Hamptons, as well as in Virginia, where he has another property. So I had begun this work on the business of Trump. And during this time, an editor came to me from Norton and said, I really like your work on Bridgegate. I'd like you to think about writing a book about the Trumps and the Kushners. And at that time, and actually he sent me an email and he said, let's have lunch. And it was June. And then he said, I'm going on vacation. And then I got involved in a story and I sort of forgot about it. And October came and I was like, oh, I should meet with that editor. And I just published a story in the New Yorker about how Donald Trump's adult children, Ivanka Trump and Donald Trump Jr., avoided criminal indictment. And it involved a visit to the Manhattan District Attorney by one of his largest donors, Mark Kazowitz, a lawyer. And after that visit, the case against the Trump family was closed, even though there was a long chain of email evidence which prosecutors had felt would make a very strong case against these members of the Trump family. But the case was dropped, and I began to think about the patterns of lying and of a certain kind of family business model that transcended generations, that had been both part of the Kushner family background, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the Trump family background. And that's when I decided, yes, I was interested in writing a book called American Oligarchs, which was a name I came up pretty quickly with, the Kushners, the Trumps, and the marriage of money and power. And it is a multi-generational family saga, which I wrote it to be read. So I really hope that you get it from the library or from your local bookstore and read the book, because I wanted to tell a lasting story, not only about these two families, but about how American democracy got to this point. And that is really the story of the book. So I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue of the book, which is set in Bedminster, New Jersey at the Trump National Golf Course, the site of Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump's wedding. And after I read that, I'll talk a little bit about what's in the rest of the book, and then I will be very happy to take your questions. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the prologue. The wedding ceremony was called for 4 in the afternoon when the late day sun shone through the clear sides of a tent the size of a gymnasium, pitched on the Bedminster grounds. Donald and Melania Trump's then 3-year-old son, Barron, who shares a given name with a former business associate bested by Trump, Barron Hilton, was the ring bearer. Chloe and Grace Murdoch, the daughters of Rupert and Wendy Murdoch, were the flower girls. Strewing white petals, they walked up a broad aisle overhung with vines, dripping with pendulous white flowers. The bridesmaids were Donald Trump Jr.'s then wife, Vanessa, and Ivanka Trump's half-sister, Tiffany, who shares a name with the company from which Donald Trump had acquired the rights to build Trump Tower in New York City. The wedding party congregated under an enormous chuppah, a canopy of white flowers covering the structure that symbolizes Jewish hospitality, the tents of Abraham, and the presence of God. Jared, grandson of Holocaust survivors, was raised to be a strict modern Orthodox Jew. The family kept kosher, they went to shul, they observed the Sabbath. Jared was supposed to marry a Jew, but then at a business luncheon arranged by a young diamond dealer, he met Ivanka Trump, whose family was Protestant. Jared and Ivanka started dating. Their parents were not happy. For a time, the couple stopped seeing each other. Wendy and Rupert Murdoch intervened, reuniting the couple on a weekend trip, and then Ivanka began the arduous task of converting to Orthodox Judaism. The wedding was lavish and elegant party and event. The marriage of Jared and Ivanka was the joining of 2 famous real estate dynasties, each braided into the worlds of politics and media and celebrity. There was also the bad boy allure of Donald Trump, the suggestion that something bold and exciting and maybe transgressive was about to happen, and that people around him could be part of it, that Donald Trump was pulling back his curtain just for them. Even for this glittering crowd, Trump's promise cast the same spell it did on primetime at NBC for the 9 million American fans of The Apprentice, that by entering into a corner of Trump's world, they too could become even more rich or famous or successful. There was also a sense of obligation. Trump had trained the political class to understand that their ever-ravenous political machines should compete for some of his purported billions, lest he mete it out to their opponents. Years later, when he was running for president, Trump laid this out clearly in an early Republican primary debate. I gave to many people. Before this, 2 months ago, I was a businessman. I gave to everybody. When they call, I give. And you know what? When I need something from them 2 years later, 3 years later, I call them. They are there for me. What did you get? Trump was asked. Well, I'll tell you what, Trump replied. Hillary Clinton, I said, be at my wedding. And she came to my wedding. You know why? She had no choice, because I gave to a foundation. Ivanka and Jared's wedding was Jewish in a Trumpian way. As women arrived, they were given elegant shawls to guard against the autumnal chill as the sun slid down the sky, but also to cover their shoulders. Ivanka herself wore a Vera Wang wedding dress, shoulders covered by white lace sleeves extending down to her elbows. In some dances, women were separated from men in the Orthodox tradition. The food, served in a separate dinner tent, also enormous, was kosher. A rabbi had walked through the tent, koshering a caterer's knife by dipping it in water. There was pastrami, corned beef, turkey, a sushi station, and Peking duck. A 13-layer cake that was almost as tall as the bride and groom, ringed with cream-colored lisianthus, roses, peonies, lilies of the valleys, and baby's breath. Charles Kushner's speech was a variant of the one he gave at every family event, every simcha, Yiddish and Hebrew for joy, a metamnim for joyous occasion, about being the son of Holocaust survivors, about the miracle of survival, about Jews thriving and prevailing, about the values of family and chesed, Hebrew for compassion or grace, and Torah. He spoke about Ivanka and how she had worked so hard to become Jewish and how the family embraced her now. Donald Trump had been bewildered by his daughter's conversion, but was gracious at his daughter's wedding. He spoke appreciatively and uncharacteristically of his first wife, Ivana, and all the work she had done to raise Ivanka, acknowledging he hadn't always been an attentive parent. The guests, who'd come to the wedding with a mix of curiosity and anticipation, obligation and appreciation, were greeted warmly. They felt, for a fleeting instance perhaps, the gravitational pull of Donald Trump's personality. That night, as guests left clutching their giveaway prayer books and a pair of Havaiana flip-flops that said Jared on one and Ivanka on the other, laced through with a string calling them a great pair, they were forced to embrace Trump's ostentatiousness, even as they participated in his display, to pay tribute to this marriage of money and power, to acknowledge the authority of the patriarchs. From the vantage point of everything they had built, the families could say, "We've arrived. You are complicit in our power. We are a force to be reckoned with. Pay respect to us." Foolishly, the world did not. So that is the prologue to the book. And the book, after an introduction, which really talks about how American politicians of both parties have allowed for an erosion of our systems that were designed to prevent corruption. So campaign finance, disclosure, white-collar prosecutions, all of that has become weaker and weaker and weaker as income inequality has been rising in the United States. And the effect of that has been that more money keeps coming into politics, and every time more money comes into politics, the system becomes broken. But the story is also about these two particular families. And I wanted to make really clear that it was about people who made specific choices, not just about choices that would necessarily be made by somebody in their position. And I spent a lot of time digging into the history of Jared Kushner's family. His grandparents were Holocaust survivors who really lived in horrific conditions under the Nazis. His grandfather lived in what the Kushner family calls a grave. It was basically a hole that was dug in the ground so the Nazis couldn't find them in the brutal Polish winter. His grandmother, Ray Kushner, had grown up upper middle class. She had gone to university in Krakow for a while in a town called Novogródek, where there was a large and thriving Jewish population. And this was part of Poland where the Nazis marched in the middle of the World War and took over the town. And at first, from the perspective of the people in town, and to get this history, I listened to a number of the testimonies that were created really beginning in the 1980s as part of the Holocaust Remembrance Movement, when there became a real conscious effort by people who knew survivors who began to realize that they were going to die and that it was important to tell their stories. So Jared Kushner's grandmother told a story, her sister told a story, and a number of their cohorts also gave their testimonies, gave oral testimonies. So I listened to these oral testimonies about this town, Novogrudek, and at first the people didn't really think that things were going to be so awful. I mean, they had to wear stars, they were not allowed to walk on the sidewalks, they had to walk in the middle of the streets, but they thought they were going to make it through. They thought Napoleon had been defeated by the Russian winter. Hitler would be too. They would be all right. And things just became worse and worse and worse. There was a cold December day when thousands of Jews were rounded up and taken to the courthouse in this town. And they were told, you go to the right and you go to the left, and to the right was to live and to the left was to die. And Jared Kushner's grandparents were told, you go to the left to die. But Jared Kushner's great-grandmother yelled to her two daughters, one of you run, so that one of you will survive. So her older daughter, Esther, broke from the line. And then after that, the Nazis said, is there anyone here who's a furrier? And Kushner means furrier. And so Jared Kushner's great-grandmother raised her hand, and the family was saved, all except for the sister who had run so that one of them might live. And she was taken to the mass graves where the Jews were shot so that they would fall into their own graves. And the conditions just got worse and worse from that. There were many more massacres. And for a while, the Jews kept thinking, the ones who survived kept thinking, there must be a reason why we have survived. There must be something that we've done, we're useful, we're going to make it through. But they soon realized that they weren't going to survive, that they were going to die. And they decided to build a secret tunnel, which they built under the Nazi barbed wire, under the searchlights. It was about 300 feet long, 60 centimeters wide, and one rainy night, it was actually the eve of the Jewish High Holy Days, the 300 or so of them who were left crawled out of the forest, crawled out of the ghetto and into the forest, where most of them made it and lived through the winter under brutal conditions and stayed there with a group of Jewish partisans who were part of the Soviet resistance. And they stayed there until after the war. When they got back to Novogrudek after the Nazis had retreated, the town was a wasteland. So Jared Kushner's grandmother and her family boarded a train posing as Greeks because Jews then were stateless. And Jared Kushner's grandmother, Ray, met up with her future husband, Yossel Berkowitz, in Budapest. They got married, and then they illegally crossed borders until they got to a refugee camp in Italy. And they were stopped for 3.5 years. They couldn't get anyone to take them in. They tried to move to what is now Israel. They tried to move to South Africa. They tried to get to Australia. No one would take them. And then finally, the Kushner family came up with an idea, which was for Jared Kushner's grandfather, Yossel Berkowitz, to pose as his father-in-law's son, because the way U.S. immigration laws were written, it was hard for a father and a son-in-law to come in together. So Yossel Berkowitz became Joe Kushner. There were no documents left to indicate otherwise, and they boarded a boat from Genoa to New York City and arrived in New York City with $2 in their pockets. So that was the beginning of the Kushner family. And there are all sorts of resonances for what happened to Jared Kushner's father, his grandfather became a very successful real estate developer. Jared's father, Charlie Kushner, became extremely successful, but also law-breaking, and actually served prison time for witness tampering and violating campaign finance laws. And all of this was happening in New Jersey as the Trump family in New York, mostly, although also in New Jersey, was finding its own ways to manipulate politics, to make political donations, and to maximize their profit in the New York real estate world. I mean, New York real estate, and New Jersey real estate also to some extent, is a limited commodity. So the way you make money is by getting the politicians who control it to allow you to profit by building higher or by paying lower taxes. Both the Kushner family and the Trump family became extremely adept at avoiding paying taxes, evading taxes outright. And at the same time that they became rich, in large part with government help, with both families, would then do everything they could to avoid paying back. So that is the beginning of the story, which traces Jared Kushner's grandparents, his father, his own life, as well as beginning on the Trump side with Donald Trump's great-grandfather, Friedrich, who immigrated from Germany partly because of inheritance laws and partly because he didn't want to have military service, and got wealthy off the hospitality industry in Washington, where he basically sold to gold prospectors food, liquor, and access to sex. And that is what became the origin of the Trump family real estate fortune. Friedrich moved back to New York. He invested in real estate. His son Fred took over. And then Fred Trump, through really a pattern of lies and misrepresentation and not paying taxes, but also building sort of modest middle-class housing that was sort of a very reliable product, became extremely wealthy. And as many of you know, then passed a great deal of that on to his son, Donald Trump, hundreds of millions of dollars, which became the basis for Donald Trump's real estate fortune. So I've been talking for a long time, and I'd love to take more questions from Penny or from anybody in the audience about what else is in the book or anything about the business of Trump. And I think if you have a question, you should raise your hand.
Mm-hmm. Raise your hand. You can also ask in the chat portion.
Could you talk a little bit about Jared's acquisition of the New York Observer?
Sure. So Jared Kushner has had a pattern of family-supported success, which he sort of views as having happened because of his own ingenuity. So Jared Kushner went to yeshiva in New Jersey, and while he was there, his father, Charlie, who did not go to an Ivy League school, he went to NYU and Hofstra Law School, made some extremely large donations to a number of Ivy League schools. Harvard was one of them, millions of dollars. And Jared Kushner, who his classmates told me was not the brightest student at his yeshiva in New Jersey, got into Harvard. And while he was at Harvard, one of the things that Charlie Kushner did was help get him started in the real estate business. So Jared Kushner became a landlord and the owner of millions of dollars worth of real estate in Somerville, Massachusetts, which he managed while he was at Harvard. And when he left Harvard, he had been given sort of millions of dollars. He'd been given help getting bank loans. But when he left Harvard, there was a profit from this real estate of about $5 million. And he moved back to New York City, having learned about the Observer on the shuttle from Boston to LaGuardia, where they used to give it away for free. Some of you may remember. And he picked it up, and when he moved to New York after Harvard, so he decided to buy a newspaper. And his father had, when Jared Kushner was at the beginning of his law school and business school career at NYU, Jared Kushner's father was arrested in a rather spectacular act of family betrayal. His father believed that his father Charlie believed that Charlie's sister Esther and his brother Murray had conspired against him with Chris Christie, and he thought that they were going to testify against him in the grand jury. So he had a prostitute hired to entrap his sister's husband, videotaped them in a hotel room and then sent the video to his sister, Esther. You may remember was the name of Ray's sister who was murdered by the Nazis. Charlie sent his sister, Esther's husband, sent his sister, Esther, a video of her husband's betrayal on the eve of their son, Jacob's engagement party.
Okay.
So all of that happened when Jared Kushner was in law school and business school. And they developed a family narrative of resentment, that this was a case that had been cooked up against them by Chris Christie. And they sort of said, screw you to New Jersey. So they put together a deal to sell their apartments in New Jersey. They had made their money in sort of middle-class housing, multifamily housing, and to buy an enormous building in Manhattan at 666 Fifth Avenue, which they've since sold. But at the same time, Jared Kushner acquired the newspaper, the New York Observer, which is a big power move in New York, because to own a newspaper gives you outsized influence. And the Observer, even though it had a small readership at the time, it was influential among opinion makers. So journalists read it and people in publishing read it, media, finance, the sort of people who controlled the industries that controlled New York read the Observer. And that was a sort of Kushner family power move. And I talk a lot in the book about how a number of people who worked at the Observer told me that Jared wasn't committed to the principles of journalism, but understood journalism to be a tool that could advance his family's political interests or his political interests or his family's business interests. And that's how he used it. And there's a number of stories that I describe in the book about how there were hit jobs that were attempted to be cooked up against various people who Jared Kushner considered to be enemies of his family or his family business, to the great dismay of the journalists who worked there. So Jared Kushner, long before the sort of assault on journalism that we've all become familiar with Donald Trump, was very much viewing as journalism as a transactional thing versus something where truth and facts would be sort of exalted or at least attempted, that journalism would attempt to sort of lay out a factual world. Jared Kushner always viewed this in a very sort of subjective manner.
I have a couple of questions, but I don't, if other people do, I wish we could move on and do some other people's questions.
Ridiculous.
Okay, we have a gentleman here, Michael Greenberg. Could you unmute yourself and then ask your question?
Yes. To what extent were the Trumps and the Kushners cooperative as you attempted to write your book?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that
come
question. I mean, so to write this book, I read over 100,000 pages of documents. I read at least 100 books. I interviewed hundreds of people, but Jared Kushner, Charlie Kushner, Ivanka Trump, and Donald Trump were sort of the main characters of the book, did not answer my questions. And in fact, many of the people that I spoke with who knew the Kushners, I mean, I spoke to scores of people who personally knew the Kushners and who had interacted with them and the Trumps, hundreds. And they, most of them were afraid. I mean, only a few people would let me use their names because they had either had personally a bad experience with a member of the Trump or Kushner family where they'd felt that they'd harmed their livelihood or their careers, or they worried that they would, or they had seen the way that Charlie Kushner treated members of his own family, the way that Donald Trump treats people every day on Twitter, the way he treats his own staff. So people were really afraid. And the way that my workaround was to talk to more and more and more and more people. So everything could be corroborated without the participation of the families. Jared Kushner and his father, Charlie Kushner, and Charlie Kushner's lawyer did answer some of my questions. And those questions are, wherever they did answer them, it's reflected in the book. But many of the questions they chose not to answer, and neither Donald Trump nor Ivanka Trump even responded to the request for the interviews.
May I ask another question? I've heard you say that Ivanka Trump most resembles her father of his adult children. I believe you said that.
Yeah.
And that she's very protective of her father. It's hard to imagine, though, that she is not at times completely flummoxed by his behavior or his
Right.
actions.
Well, it is hard to imagine, but there's no evidence that she is flummoxed. And I think, the story, there's a lot of different kinds of betrayals that happen in the book. There's a sort of family betrayal, and there's a sort of betrayal of a certain kind of immigrant ethos. But one of the other betrayals in the book is the betrayal of New York. And it really struck me as I was reporting this book, because I spoke to dozens of people who felt that they were personal friends with Jared or Ivanka and were sure that when they got to the White House, they would curb Donald Trump's worst instincts and that they would bring a note of reason. And that when they attempted to reach out, they told me, and this was over and over again, they felt rebuffed. They felt the answer they got was essentially from Jared, I will always defend my father-in-law. And from Ivanka as well. Ivanka Trump, from all of my research, is in every way like her father, except that she is disciplined and on message. But everything else that we understand about Trump and his way of doing business and the values that he brings to business are also reflected in Ivanka. And these are families that really privilege the inside circle. They privilege families. So long as Ivanka Trump is Donald Trump's daughter, there is no indication to believe she will ever cross him or will ever really sort of challenge him in a major way. And certainly a lot of people thought that that would happen, but it hasn't happened at all to any extent that I have been able to detect. I had a question about the word oligarch from one of you. And it says, I've only heard the word oligarch used to describe very wealthy Russians. Can you define this in your title? And I think that there's a number of sort of layers to the word oligarch, but one of them has directly to do with this idea of family and us and them. And in the epilogue of my book, I talk about how it is no accident that Trump as president has privileged his own business interests, his friends' business interests, people who give him money's business interests. He's made it very, very clear that to win his favor, you have to pay him money. And I think one of the most vivid examples of this was during the infamous Ukraine phone call when the president of Ukraine, this is not the part that people remember, but the president of Ukraine said, I stayed in your hotel. And this is something that world leaders have come to understand that they need to do. They need to pay Donald Trump by going to his golf courses or getting memberships or staying in his hotels, and that he will look favorably on that. And he's made quite clear that he will. So that is a form of oligarchy, a form of perverting the sort of people's interests for his own family interests. But it's also a worldview. It's a worldview of us and them. So the people that are important are Donald Trump and the wealthy people who support him and his family. It's very much tied to both the nativism that has pervaded his administration, that sort of the sense that some people are expendable or lesser, the racism that I think has really, been present for decades, but that has come into stark relief. And also, I would argue his response to the coronavirus. I mean, we are now, I haven't even checked the latest numbers, but we're now 130,000, 140,000 people are dead. And the president still acts as if some portion of the population is expendable. And that is anti-democratic, and it is an oligarchic form of government. And I think we really face a choice in our country about what kind of government we want to have, and whether it's going to be government where the rule of law prevails and democracy prevails, or whether it's going to be ruled by a wealthy few. We are certainly moving in that direction now. But, I always believe in the possibility mean, the solution in American history to oligarchy has always been democracy. That's what happened in the sort of last time when we became really close to oligarchy, which I would argue was in the Gilded Age, the last Gilded Age in the late 19th century. And there were a series of progressive reforms which made the country more democratic. Now, we've obviously never been perfect, but we've moved between different poles. And right now we're in a sort of very dangerously oligarchic form of government.
How has your book been received? I mean, I noticed the people who've read it and commented on it are the people who
well, one of the things, yeah,
a lot. Is it making a difference? Are the right people reading it? Can it make a difference?
I think that, this is a broad story I want to tell, not only about these two families, but about American democracy, sort of these two strands. And I am extremely gratified that people are really enjoying the narrative of it. I read all the books about Trump, and most of them are not that good. And all the books by the ex-administration officials and the tell-alls, and most of them are sort of real slogs to get through. And I wanted to write a book that would be a great story, and that would be a really, really moving and powerful read, and that would tell us something about these families that are running the country, but would also tell us about what we need to do as citizens of a democracy to reclaim a more democratic form of government. And I think for the most part, what has been incredibly gratifying to me is people who've read that have been taken up by the stories of betrayal. And the story of Jared Kushner's grandparents was particularly a story that a lot of people didn't know or didn't really fully appreciate, but that also have said to me that they feel moved by the way that our country has moved to a system of government that is more like Ukraine's. It had been for decades, it had been bipartisan US policy for the United States to try to make Ukraine less corrupt and more like the United States. And what's happened under the Trump administration is exactly the opposite, that our country has become more like Ukraine. And we've seen this recently with the sort of legal maneuvers, with the Roger Stone's commutation and the dismissal of the case against Michael Flynn, where it's clear that if you're a friend of the president, you can get special favor. That is an oligarchic form of government.
Okay, we had a question from Barbara, but Barbara, you have to unmute yourself. I tried, I couldn't. And then Phyllis, I did see your hand up.
Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, okay. I just wonder about Jared's purchase of 666 Fifth Avenue and his financing for that and how that stands. And also, is there a history of the Kushner properties not renting to blacks, as there is a history of the Trump family doing that?
Yeah, well, so I think what you're referring to regarding 666 is the sale of 666, in which the building was sold to Brookfield Assets, which, as many people have pointed out, has a branch that is connected to the government of Qatar. I don't think this was a great deal for the Kushners. I know from reporting that they were having a very hard time selling this property, and that they were able to sell it for their debt so that they didn't owe money on it. So they sort of came out even, which is not necessarily a stellar track record when you think about the years in New York real estate. It was 2008 through 2018. So most real estate appreciated significantly in value. The Kushners were able to get 666 Fifth Avenue off their hands. But what is problematic about that sale is a sort of broader question about the perception in the world. And it's corruption 101, that foreign leaders who want to act corruptly will put assets in the names of their children, or that other people who want to corrupt the families will do it through their children. I mean, that happens across the globe. So what happens when you have Jared Kushner involved as he was in Mideast policy and involved in policy having to do with Qatar, you have a situation where it's impossible to answer the questions about the motivations for doing something with somebody or not doing a deal with somebody. Or was it because he didn't get some financing that he wanted, that he supported the blockade of Qatar? We don't know the answers to these questions, but that is the problem of having not only the president, but also his daughter and son-in-law still connected to their family businesses while also running the country. And that is a sort of fundamental sort of defining aspect, troubling aspect of the Trump administration, is the way the president's business deals continue and that he knows about them while he is also doing the people's business. The other question that you asked, about race. So both Joe Kushner, Jared Kushner's grandfather, and Fred Trump were the beneficiaries of massive amounts of Federal Housing Administration-backed loans. Fred Trump starting in the 1940s and Joe Kushner starting a little later in the 1950s and 60s. And the Federal Housing Administration was, at one point in its history, had covenants that it enforced that said you cannot mix races. If you mix races, you are lowering the value and we will not back a loan. Like they would say that a house had to have, a certain number of bathrooms per bedroom, and it had to be a certain size in order to be a viable thing, and it couldn't be situated near a barn, and also that it had to be in a not racially mixed neighborhood. So that was the trajectory of these these family businesses. And both of them were supported by a stream of federal policies that were meant to encourage segregation and white flight. So the Federal Highway Act of the 1950s built highways which made it much easier for white people to get out of cities, and which encouraged those trends. There were mortgage tax incentives that made it easier for people to live in segregated way. So the fundamental structures of sort of American capitalism post-war promoted segregation, and both the Trump family and the Kushner family benefited from those policies.
Are you related to Carl Bernstein?
I'm not related to Carl Bernstein.
No, thank you. Okay.
Sorry, Phyllis.
Are the Kushner and Trump families friendly with each other? Do they socialize together, or do they not like each other?
So it's a really interesting question, because one of the things that I did in the course of this book was try to find photographs of the families together. And there were almost no occasions that I could find where Charlie Kushner and his wife Cyril were in a picture with Donald and Melania Trump, or any of other Donald Trump's wives, although they didn't really meet him until after Melania was in the picture. And they both have very distinct social circles. That said, they're both part of these, both the Kushner family and the Trump family are these sort of incredibly strong family ties. And, when the grandparents get together, the grandparents get together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Phyllis, you want to ask your question?
I wanted to know if Trump wasn't so crazy about his daughter marrying into the Kushner family. Did he then come around because it would be like two major real estate families blending? And did the Kushner family come around because maybe they felt,
Right.
the Trump,
So,
the Trump had strength?
I mean, Ivanka Trump converted to Judaism, and that was a sort of had to happen before she was going to be able to marry Jared. What people told me who knew the couple was that Ivanka was really smitten with Jared and really wanted to marry him. And for a while they broke up, but then they got back together, and sort of the necessary precondition of that was her converting to Judaism. On the Trump side, Donald Trump found a real kindred spirit in Jared Kushner. They had a sort of shared a similar worldview. They began to do, not long after Jared and Ivanka were married, the sort of the families began to sort of help each other out. Jared Kushner was particularly helpful with Donald Trump in helping him getting financing from Deutsche Bank, which is sort of continually in the news. And Jared Kushner had a longstanding relationship, and he brought that in. And then Donald Trump helped introduce Jared Kushner to somebody else who could help him finance some of the debt of 666 Fifth Avenue. And Donald Trump really, I take him at his word about what he says about his son-in-law. He went to Harvard. He's smart. He is married to his daughter Ivanka, and he's in real estate. But he has the same worldview where all of these things, business and politics and family, they all mix without a sense of why that may serve his, Jared Kushner's interests, but don't necessarily serve the country that they're ostensibly serving. I feel like we should take maybe one or two more questions because I know it's a hot day and dinner time.
I did see a hand up. Maureen.
He's had so many failed businesses and bankrupt businesses, and I was wondering if you ever got a true picture of his true wealth and the source of it.
I think it's pretty clear that his wealth came from his father and the money that he passed along from his father. Now, along the way, Trump has done business with all kinds of people who've had brushes with the law. He has had people buy his properties with laundered money. He has made it very easy for, he's built properties or not built them, but he's licensed his name for building properties in places like Uruguay and Panama and Baku, places that have a really terrible record of corruption, that are on the sort of lowest place of the Transparency International Corruption Index. So, but it doesn't seem that those are huge streams of money. It's just, it was easy money for him to license his buildings, especially in dealing with these countries where there were so few rules and regulations. So we do see this pattern of failure, and it's really an extraordinary thing, because I think we're sort of all witnessing in our country right now the consequences of that. That for Donald Trump, success is the perception of success, and success means he wins, and it doesn't really matter who else loses. And the tragedy of now is that a public health crisis means that to win, everybody has to win together. And this is something that is completely outside of Donald Trump's toolkit.
Can you, hello?
Yes.
Hi.
Can you, using your knowledge of the Trumps and Donalds especially, can you project what his reaction will be when he loses the 2020 election?
Well, after I covered the 2016 election, I got out of the prediction business. I think the answer is we don't know. I mean, people who know Donald Trump, Michael Cohen, in his testimony before Congress, raised serious concerns about whether Donald Trump would give up power if he lost the election. I mean, I think that it will be a very difficult situation because the country is so polarized if it's a close election. I think if it is a resounding defeat, and then it becomes more difficult for him to not step aside in an orderly transition of power. I mean, I think we should remind ourselves that he didn't actually think he was going to win in 2016 and then did win. All right, last question.
Have you read his niece's book? And
I have read Mary Trump's book. Yes.
You find it fits in with your perception of him?
Yes. I mean, I think that that is the story of Mary Trump's book, of Mary Trump, which I sort of allude to in my book, is Fred Trump Jr. was Donald Trump's older brother, Mary's father. And he was the one that was never successful enough for the family business. And he became a pilot and an alcoholic, and he died at a very young age. And Mary Trump and her brother were written out of Fred Sr.'s will at a time when her brother had a child that had with a very rare neurological disorder. And at one point after Mary Trump and her brother said that they were going to sue, Donald Trump withdrew health insurance from the family with this who had been in and out of the neonatal ICU. So Mary Trump is a clinical psychologist, and she has revealing anecdotes about sort of the family, but I think the most interesting stuff comes at the end, where she talks about the lawsuit, and then she also talks about being a source for the New York Times and their very big tax story about how Fred Trump set up all of these sort of sham companies to enable him to pass money to his children, including Donald Trump, while avoiding paying taxes.
Interesting. Andrea, this is probably a good place to end, but I hope you'll promise us that you will pay us another visit.
Sure, I was sorry because I was saying to Penny that it made me realize this was going to be my weekend in Southampton. So I didn't get to have it, but here's the book, American Oligarchs. Please read it. Please tell your friends. If you've read it already, please leave a review on Goodreads or Amazon, because it really, really helps. And particularly now where it's so hard to sort of get out, I can't like sign a stack of book. I can't, make people make an impulse buy. But please read it. That's the most important thing. And if you like it, please tell your friends.
Andrea, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
It's wonderful to have you, and I think we'll all be there with all of our friends when you come back. In some form, you will come back. I hope you will.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. All right. Have a good night.
Thank you.